Mhm.
Yeah, I wanted to thank very, very much Dr. Nizar Habash for accepting to do this. I saw him recently, about a week ago, at the ACL conference in Rabat. I was visiting. Dr. Habash, is a prominent member of the Arabic natural language processing community. He is currently running the Camel Lab at New York University, Abu Dhabi. And you've been there for at least 10 years, right?
11 now, yeah. Yeah.
11, yeah. We actually even had an AUI or spent some time there
Mm.
working on towards a PhD. And she stayed, didn't come back to Morocco. And yeah, he holds a PhD from University of Maryland in, I guess, computational linguistics, computer science, such matters, and he has two undergraduate degrees, um, in one in more language-oriented language and linguistics, and one in computer engineering. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Um, and moreover, and he has been recently the recipient of numerous recognitions and awards, including some of the top ones in the association, in the computational linguistics community. More than that, for me, Dr. Habash has a personal meaning because it was my meeting him in 2000 that signaled the entry of my research in the Arabic computational linguistics community that happened on the first edition of the North American Association for Computational Linguistics conference.
Mm.
I was looking for a job, so getting a paper accepted there was, and and I guess at that time, Dr. Habash was still a grad student.
That's right. Yeah.
I think you got 3 years after that. So
Yeah.
it's been a long, long uh, friendship, colleague relationship, and I'm very thankful for him, to him for taking the time to speak to us about an era in which he is undoubtedly one of the experts. Take it
Thank you.
away.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Violetta. It was fantastic to see you last week in Rabat. Thanks, everybody. So just, I don't see anybody here. I don't know what the room looks like or how many people are in the room. Can I get a sense of like how many people I'm talking to? Just about.
There are about 13 people in the room, and maybe a couple more online.
Excellent.
Um, and those who, yeah, and some
Okay.
other may migrate in. Uh,
Excellent. Excellent. If I see anybody jumping in and asking to enter, I will let them enter from my side. Okay, great. So, thank you, everybody. I mean, Violetta, when I saw her last week, mentioned that she's teaching this course on NLP, and asked if I could say a few words on Arabic and syntax. As I understand, you've already gone through a lot of different aspects of NLP, including you've been introduced to some syntax and syntactic modeling. So, my plan for today is to kind of the bulk will be talking about Arabic resources, tree banks, parsing tools for doing annotation and the such. But I will do a bit of an introduction to syntax. And, feel free to stop me and ask any questions. Somebody has to actually speak up because I don't see anybody. As I said, I don't see any icons telling me that there's a question. Okay, so let me start here. I mean, this is actually everything that Violetta already said, so I'm gonna skip that. I just want to, plug in a promotion for my lab, the Camel Lab. So please check it out. It's camellab.com. And also, if you're working on Arabic of any sort, I would strongly recommend you consider our toolkit called Camel Tools, which has been out now for a few years and is quite popular. We're always interested in people giving us feedback, and also they're interested in helping in anything to participate. It's an open toolkit, so just a general service to the community, basically. All right, so syntax and Arabic. Often And as I understand, almost everybody here is an Arabic speaker. When we're introduced to syntax and grammar, we're introduced to something called Arab, where you would probably see something like this and say, ba حرف جر اسم مجرور بحرف الجر إلى آخره, and this kind of structure. And Arab, in essence, is a syntactic representation. It's actually spelling out morphology, syntax, and also dependency relationship between the different words. For example, when I say ba is a preposition and usum is usum majrur, it's a direct object of sorry, it's an object of preposition. I'm specifying the relationship between these two. Same thing when I say that this is mudaf. Usm and Allah, Usm Jalala Mudaf ilayh. I'm specifying a relationship here between Usm and Allah. And then the two, Ar-Rahman and Rahim, are both specified as not or an adjective, a modifier of the word Allah, which also specifies a relationship between them. This is basically classic dependency representation, a syntactic representation that is commonly used in NLP and in linguistics. And, to kind of go from this version to this version, which basically carries, in essence, all of that kind of information. Well, not all. Obviously, I'm simplifying to a degree, but we do have access to all of that information within our tools. This is how you would approach the same experience of Arab as a syntactic representation in a computational setting. I put in here some of the terms in Arabic and English, and I like to put in my slides Arabic and English terms because I think it's important that we should be able to talk about this in Arabic and English. I've given these talks also, in Arabic, if need be, and I'm happy to answer questions about the Arabic aspect and, not just the language itself, but the meta-linguistic kind of experience of discussing it. But in essence, all of these features that I show you here at the bottom that have the morphological information, like gender, number, date, etc., and the syntax, all of that comes out of the tools that we've developed in the Camel. Okay, so syntax. Violetta warned me that I should zoom through these slides a bit fast this part because you're all familiar with it, but just in case, obviously we're interested in the studying of how words, when they come together, create meaning in a sentence. As opposed to kind of understanding the structure within the word, which would be the study of morphology and computational morphology. And of course, I'm sure you've seen the colorless green ideas, sleep furiously example as an example where we can construct a meaning syntactically, even though the meaning as a whole is not necessarily, coherent or meaningful, but it's still, you have a very good sense watching this, reading the sentence, that it is syntactically correct, as opposed to if it was, sleep idea, green, furiously colorless, which also has the same set of words, but is not syntactically correct in that case. And of course, doing this presentation in 2026, one of the questions that come to mind is like, why should I care anymore? LLMs solve everything. Well, LLMs don't solve everything. In fact, the performance in some of these cases are still, there's some problems, particularly when you have limited resource languages. And also, if you're modeling for things that you want interpretability and control. And here's what I mean by that, just being able to explicitly explain, why some error, let's say in a grammar checker is one way or the other, so you can give feedback that is very concrete and not just rely on the probabilities within the LLM model that generate that answer. And control is in the sense of if you wanted to do a regeneration or phrasing that involves some syntactic decision of some sort, you want to be able to say, change this structure to that structure because I have a particular purpose for it. So these are still open problems of how to do this. And in addition to all of this, I would say just being able to understand, what does it mean to have a syntactically structured analysis of a sentence, or allows you as a professional person working with AI and NLP in general to basically be able to come up with a coherent definitions of the problem. It's not like, oh, it looks good or it doesn't look good. It's a very shallow definition, as opposed to it seems that there's a systematic kind of error, when it comes to this kind of phenomena or that kind of phenomena, and that could be interesting. Okay. Some of the categories that I refer to, I also assume just making sure that in case you have not seen them before, we can talk about the parts of speech or the syntactic categories, which can be lexical or functional. So lexical are the open classes like the verbs and the nouns, and functionals are the glue, the syntactic glue really that brings everything together. I will make some references to this when we discuss Arabic later on also. And the frameworks that I will be talking about will be primarily dependency, even though I will hint at constituency. I'm going to skip the middle point here just for speed issue. So, constituency, as I understand, have been discussed to some degree in your class, and but the idea here is not to, although we often think of constituency representation and dependency representations as different kind of frameworks. In fact, the concept of constituency is still present in all of these, in every single representation of syntax. Is the idea that you can group a bunch of words together so that they have a particular relationship within and a particular relationship outside of their group. So when you take a sentence like this one, the diligent student is reading a book about China in the classroom, it should be immediately evident that structures like the diligent student is a unit, is a constituent that behaves together, and the diligent student is not, or diligent student is reading is not necessarily, right? It's something is broken within it. But a book is goes together, China, and in the classroom is also are all independent, low level constituents. And we can now start growing and say, oh, in the classroom and about China also comes together. A book about China, right? As opposed to a book, as opposed to about China in the classroom, which is a very different kind of idea in that case, and so on. These groupings, which if you do the mental exercise of looking at a sentence as part of trying to understand this and just start thinking, what goes together, the idea is that there's a very strong intuition, and that which we translate as your understanding natively of syntax, that basically allows you to see how these things cluster together. And a syntactic tree is simply a projection or a representation of this kind of thing. The lower in the tree, at any point in the tree, you look at a node, and you know that the subtree under it basically represents a circle or an ellipsis of this kind that we have here. Okay, so that's basically what we're trying to do when we talk about syntactic representations. Now, people have been working on syntax for a long time, and you will see I will use many different representations. And the goal is not to confuse you, but rather to kind of enlighten you and open your mind to the possibilities that you can talk about the same concept of grouping in many different ways. These two representations here are basically exactly equivalent. They have the same exact information, they're just represented in slightly different ways. The one on the top is actually what is used in the Penn tree bank. And of course, context-free grammars, which are strongly connected to this concept of constituency, because you're basically defining in the expansion of context-free grammar, what the grouping is and what its members are. So to say that a determiner and a noun make a noun phrase, and that noun phrase can then be used inside of a sentence that has a sentence that goes to a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, is how we would actually represent this. This basically allows us to create really complex looking structures that can be actually infinite in size, potentially, right? So language can be infinite, but the grammar that describes it is finite. So, and that simply happens by having some recursion of some sort. So if you look at a sentence like this, the man saw the cow that tossed the dog, that worried the cat, that killed the rat, and I can keep on going, right? This is all happening because I have a relative phrase that starts with that, followed by a verbal phrase, which has inside of it a noun phrase, which can also have inside of it a relative phrase. So you have like this repetition. Okay, so this is something that is basically why, linguists find working on syntax fascinating, and the idea that children learn this naturally as kids is and are able to basically recognize these structures without any trouble is what makes this kind of work interesting. With the current models that we're using in a lot of NLP modeling, we actually don't have that kind of representation explicitly anymore. In the past, people used to actually explore them explicitly and sometimes implicitly, like formally saying there may be groupings. I'm not going to label them, or here's formal groupings with the names that goes with them. But today, we're just looking at things like, attention and, how much things are dependent on other things near them, which captures to some degree syntax, but not in the way that we actually understand it or we believe that humans actually model it. Now, from this, I'm going to jump to the other syntactic formalism, which I'm going to talk about a lot more later, which I understand you may have not necessarily been exposed to as much, and that is dependency representations. So, dependencies are basically another way of representing the syntactic structure and the syntactic constituency units. The main difference from constituencies is that we don't have any intermediate nodes in the tree that represent the label of the grouping or the label of the constituency. So whereas, for example, in a constituency tree or a phrase structure tree, I could have something that's called a PP or a prepositional phrase that has a preposition with a noun phrase that in turn has determiner on a noun. In a dependency, the nodes in the tree are the words themselves, or I should precisely say the tokens representing the words. So for all intents and purposes, it's the same as the words in a language like English, but in Arabic, it's a little bit more complicated, and I'll show you examples in a bit of that. But the difference here is instead of saying like in the classroom, is has the classroom together make a noun phrase and then in comes to that noun phrase and it makes a prepositional phrase. What we have here, we simply say that there is in and under it there is a prepositional object and then under that there is a determiner. This should almost feel a little bit like the example that I used at the beginning in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Harf jar, usm majroor, and so on, which is actually classic dependency representation in that case. And so when we talk about dependency syntax, we typically, as I said, I'm just repeating, we use the words as the nodes, and then the edges are basically arrows that point from parent to child where there is a dependency. And the idea is that one dependent on the other, and then you can specify these types of the relations of these dependency, saying things like this is a prepositional modifier, a prepositional object. In this particular example, there's an opposition, which is like a badal in Arabic, and so on. Now, there is no unified naming that is natural and general to represent all dependency syntax, but every system of dependency would have its own set of terminology that it uses. So whenever you're looking at tree banks, let's say if you get into this area, don't necessarily assume that there is a common agreement on the labels or even how subtrees could actually be represented with each other. For example, if I look at ports and immigration, this is one way of representing the relationship of something and something. You could have and at the top with ports and immigration under it. And also, in some cases, we have ports followed by and under it and followed by immigration. Which one is correct? Well, they're all correct. You just have to be consistent, right? And you cannot evaluate one system against a different definition. And that also brings up the issue that is central to any kind of annotation task that we do, which is that we need to have guidelines and have agreements between the annotators and make sure that, if the humans cannot agree with each other, how are we going to evaluate that machines are doing the job that we want the humans to do? Right. But those are really where most of the devilish stuff happening, the details of these differences. But everything that I said so far about nodes, words being nodes, the relationships, the arrows, that's pretty much consistent across, I would say, the vast majority of dependency. I don't say all because I've seen a lot of things. Sometimes there are things that are a bit different. And okay, this is just kind of back to the same example where you can see this is just a different representation of a dependency tree. Again, another variant, basically. All the importantly, in this particular one, which is the one that we use in the Arabic work, by the way. We show also at the bottom the exact ordering of the words in the sentence. We find that to be useful just for readability purposes. And then one other thing about dependency trees, they're usually represented, and this is if you're a computer scientist, you know this should be familiar to how would you represent any kind of a graph or tree structure through an adjacency matrix. Similarly here, it's just that we would basically have this particular example. Every word gets a word index. It has a part of speech, the word itself, and then the parent and the relation. And in essence, what we're doing when we're saying we're parsing is that you start with the list of words and its indices because that's given, right? I mean, word number one is number one, word number two is number two, etc. And the goal is to generate the last three columns. In fact, some people define it as the last three columns, I used to do that. Some people now just think of the parsing as just the last two columns. So you will find in some papers, for example, where you don't worry about the part of speech anymore. In fact, some of the parsers that we have for dependency now just give you the parent and the relation, and they don't worry as much about the part of speech that you can get from a different morphological disambiguator. But that is basically the task of parsing. Given a set of words, identify for every word its parent and identify the relationship that goes with it. One of the nice things about dependencies, as opposed to phrase structure, is that the vocabulary of the task that you're trying to kind of label into is quite limited, right? Because your parent index is limited by the number of words that you have in your sentence. You cannot be an index to a word that is outside of the space of the sentence itself. And the relations are also quite limited and specified. So in some way, it's a really nice classification task. And a lot of the techniques that build on it, actually, that do parsing, rely on it at some level at the heart of it, as it's a classification task with an additional bells and whistles, of course, to kind of maintain that the structure has to be free of any cycles and perhaps non-projective and so on and so forth. All right. So one more example about the relationship between constituency and dependency, and now I'm slowly taking you into the Arabic space. If you take a sentence like this one, 50 ألف سائح زاروا لبنان في أيلول الماضي. And if you look at the trees, note first of all, obviously Arabic is written from right to left, but the trees, and there's no right to left in logically. There's only, first to last. Khamsun is the first word, al-Madi is the last word. And then when we think of the tree here, the tree is being printed from left to right, could have been done the other way around. So there's just a slight bias one way or the other. It's not meaningful, it's just a technical decision that we have to make as we make these decisions. And here you can see that alf sa'ih, so sa'ih is a noun phrase, that it's a noun that it makes the noun phrase. Alf sa'ih is basically the next level of noun phrase that's above it. And let's see if I can actually use my pen here, right? And then khamsuna alf, the 50,000 becomes the next level, and so on and so forth for the rest of these. Right. And if I'm comparing, oh, sorry, let me turn this off. Choop, choop. Okay. Right. Okay, still keeps wanting to use this pen. I'm gonna try to kill it here. There we go. Great. So if I start looking, and what I have on the right side is a dependency tree that's equivalent. And here, I hope you can see the coloring around the word sa'ah. It should be a little bit kind of, more, I guess, bluish. So the the structure of the noun phrase kind of correlates with the structure that is in the dependency, that these two are dependent on each other. And in fact, this is kind of an important detail. Like as we keep going up, we're doing the same thing, you can see Aylul al-Madi goes together, Fi Aylul al-Madi goes together, and then the whole thing comes together. And what I just did here is actually very similar to a common algorithm that we use, which I won't be able to talk about here a lot, but the tools for is available from our lab GitHub repos. If you email me, I'm happy to share with you. It's basically the problem of how do I go from a constituency to a dependency, and the core concept, it's called head percolation, is that at any phrasal level, you can basically decide that what is the main head. So between elf and sa'ah, we would decide, well, it's elf followed by noun phrase. Elf is the head in that case. And then when I'm comparing khamsun with elf sa'ih, I decide that khamsun is the head and so on and so forth. Someone will say, but why is khamsun the head? Shouldn't it be sa'ih as the tourist? And that's a really good question. Often this is one of the things that confuses people. And it's part of the decision about designing dependencies. So maybe let me say a word on this. It's actually one of the main differences between some of the common dependency representations, although they agree that it's words, that it's relations between words, etc. But there's a question of the primacy of syntax or the primacy of semantics in what you're doing. So if you take this example, I'm just going to dig, hopefully your Arabic knowledge will come to be useful here. So if you say 50 ألف سائح زاروا, the 50,000 زائح, as you know, should be the topic or the مبتدأ, right? And then after it is a جملة فعلية, as a verbal sentence starts with zaru, right? And then the waw alif is the subject that basically refers to 50,000 in that case, right? Because these are the subject 50,000 people that came in. Now, if we're doing this in English, in fact, some of the models that do this in English would actually say tourist is the head is the subject. It's about tourists that are the subject, and then they're modified as being 50,000, and that's a completely reasonable representation, right? Absolutely. The problem with Arabic, if you do this, you face another complexity in Arabic, which you can see here. That if you look at the case ending, right, خمسون is nominative, مرفوع, right? Alpha is accusative, mansub, right? Because it's actually تمييز. 50,000 50,000 because it's also mudaf to سائح. And سائح is singular. So the word we're referring to one tourist that is basically described as a 50,000 type or 50,000 of the type tourists, right? The question is, if we put سائح at the top, we will have a subject that looks like it's genitive. So يعني فاعل مجرور in that case, 50,000 سائح. And that was not considered something that is attractive in designing these trees, as opposed to 50, which is مرفوع. It is a nominative subject, and it is actually the subject. And then the rest kind of follows after that, from it. So if I put the primacy in my design on syntax and morphosyntax, this would be the tree structure. 50 dominates or is the parent of elf, and elf is the dominant, the mother of the next node, which is sa'ah. If I decide to translate it to something that is more semantic, I would put sa'ah at the top, and then I have to forget all about the details about subjects being genitive as a simple decision. I have to say, well, subjects can be genitive, they can be accusative, they can be nominative, but you really need to know, like semantic subjects, but you need to know what are they being modified by, and then you have to go and resolve that issue. So this is kind of a cool problem, actually, in Arabic that is to some degree a bit open for how to actually solve generically. I hope this was clear of some of the decisions that we're making. I'll be talking a bit more about it. Now, I cannot talk about dependencies without referring to the most famous dependencies, which is the consortium of universal dependencies. I will not talk a lot about it, but you should be aware of it if you know anything about syntax today. So UD, or universal dependencies, was this huge effort that was started, in about the year 2020. I think 2021 was the first big paper on it. And it's basically an effort that was led, to my knowledge, by Joachim Nivra, and had basically managed to get a lot of people to basically work together. Their idea is to create a representation that is inspired by a comment that I made earlier about the deeper semantic representation that brings all of these different languages in the world closer to each other so that we can then compare their differences in a kind of a more systematic way. So the idea is that when I'm comparing trees, like if you take the example that I had earlier, the version that would put 50 and then 1,000 and then tourist is maybe less nice from a universality point of view, versus the version that would say it's tourist that's being modified as 50,000 would be the version that is used in universal dependencies. And that's in fact what we do. If you're interested in syntax, something really cool to look at. A lot of people report on UD when they do syntax because they can then immediately report on like a ridiculous number of languages. I actually don't know the latest number of languages that they have. It's quite large. But they basically, with this consortium, they agreed on a particular set of tags and features, etc. And these are the ones that should basically be used across all of the languages, right? And it ends up leading to some very weird constructions in some cases from a native language point of view. But then the trade-off is, metalinguistic generalizability across languages, which is important for some people and maybe not as important for other people, right? But it's understanding the relationship between all of these levels is really important. Now, before I slide further into the discussion of Arabic, I want to make also like one other kind of statement about universality here, which I think is important. And that is if how syntax can allow us to actually see the differences between languages in a more structured way. So this example is from a paper I worked on a few years back on translation from Arabic to Chinese. And it's actually, to my knowledge, it was like the first paper on this. Everybody was so interested in translating to English from everything else. And they were translating from English to English from Arabic and Chinese. And I worked with a Chinese student when I was at Columbia. And we basically put a really lovely paper on basically how to translate from Arabic to Chinese and evaluate models for doing that. So I use this example to kind of just give you a sense of how languages may have different syntax, but that difference can quite be systematic at times. So if I look at this just very basic sentence, I can look at multiple dimensions of relationships. So for example, the subject and the verb order. So English and Chinese, they both have the subject appear before the verb, right? Like French and Italian and many other languages. Arabic, as you know, has both orders. The verb subject is the primary order for the verbal sentences. And then we also have subject and verb, right? Which has a slight different twist in it of how the agreement happens. When it comes to verbs versus prepositional phrases, pretty much all these languages go with verb first and prepositional phrase after, although Chinese apparently has a preference for temporals and locations to basically appear pre-verbally. So you'd be um, the student, the diligent student in the classroom read, right? You can see this. It put in the classroom read, that is considered the more fluent version of talking, of saying that sentence in Chinese. Now, the last part is the modifiers of nouns, which I think is really fascinating because here we're talking about you have a noun like talib, a student, and you can say طالب المجتهد, you can say الطالب الذي درسته في الماضي, the one who I taught, or you can say, طالب بالصف الأول, which is a possess مضاف مضاف إليه or a possession relation. Now, in Arabic, the noun is always first in this case. It's a head initial construction, we would say. So the head, the noun, is first, and then you have all these modifications that comes after. Chinese is lovely, exactly the opposite. You actually flip the order completely. You always put the adjective or the possessive or the relative first, and then you put a special particle called de, and then you put the noun. So Arabic and Chinese in that regard, syntactically, the trees are flipped. Now, the beauty, when you talk about it in syntax, it's like you're having these mobiles that just, the thing that hang, I think that's what they're called, that have like different elements that move around. It's basically what you're doing. You're just saying, okay, Chinese just, twists it, or Arabic twists it from Chinese, and that's how you get these different orders. English is funny in this case, is that it actually has different combinations. The adjectives are before, the relatives are after, and the possessive happens in both kinds. Like you can put an apostrophe s or an of the possessive, right? So this is again just to give you a sense of why people think syntax, can be useful and meaningful for things like relating different languages. It's useful for language pedagogy, and of course, historically was used a lot in work on translation. All right. Any questions so far? As I said, I don't see the rooms. I don't read your faces. I don't know if you're confused or not. Should I keep going, or should we take a break and take some questions?
Questions? Everything is brilliantly clear. Um, I think you can keep going. But I
Okay,
like the
great.
comment you made about the Khamsuna being the head, being considered the head. I was not aware that that was the motivation, the fact that you're actually looking at the case and it makes sense for the case to have
Yeah,
a
yeah,
nominative.
yeah. In fact, I mean, I can share with you that, part of the reason I got into syntax was basically following a discussion at the LDC with Chris Manning at the time, who was visiting with them, at a conference, I can remember. But it was something where he said, like, if they use basic head percolation rules, they got subjects that were genitive. And he's like, I don't know what you guys are doing in Arabic or at the LDC. This makes no sense. And of course, he was using a different definition of head percolation that made sense, semantically. And that kind of got me into this, actually. That was kind of the key issue there. I use this, by the way, for the students, not to, I mean, the goal was not to drop the name. Chris Manning is a fantastic guy and has affected many of us in the field. He's a quite an important character. But what I wanted to say is, like, every time something looks weird, it usually means there is a wonderful things hiding behind it, right? So whenever you are puzzled by something and you don't understand it, use it as a gift from God. He's putting something in front of you that say, pay attention here, something is off. Now, it may be that you're confused, and many times we are confused, and then that's good. That's good for us to know that we're confused. But a lot of the times, I think it kind of does make us think of, oh, I see this intuitively in a very different way. Maybe I need to look at it in a deeper way, or look at why is it being done this way, or what were they thinking? What is their logic? Do I agree with their logic and their assumptions? So especially as you guys are dealing with data analysis and things like this, this becomes something kind of cool to look at. So just take this for that purpose, at least as a general, advice for how to stay engaged and excited about doing work and research in this field. Okay, so Arabic sentences. Sorry if this sounds like a little bit of boring, going back to grammar school and elementary school and صف الدروس. I used to. I'm gonna say this joke in Arabic. يعني أنا تعلمت اللغة العربية تعلمت كل تعليمي كان باللغة العربية فعليا، حتى التوجيهي في مدارس عربية. فكانت اللغة الإنجليزية هي لغة إضافية، يعني أخذتها كان صف واحد في اليوم لمدة ساعة. فاللغة الإنجليزية بالنسبة لي هي شيء تعلمته يعني حتى في الجامعة كان أكثر. لكن كنا نضحك على إنه صف اللغة العربية وكان صف الإرعاب as opposed to الإعراب, because many times it was really hard to understand, what the teachers were trying to get. And they were quite mean, if you remember the classic Arabic school teacher would, like, you make a mistake or whatnot. So anyway, so hopefully this will give you a new relationship with Arabic Arab, and it's less irab and more something, fun to think about. So Arabic, classically we say, has two types of verbal sentence construction. Sorry, sentence constructions. One is the verbal sentence, where we have a verb that has a subject and an object, and those are nominative and accusative, or marfu' and mansub. And then there is the second kind, or what's called nominal sentences. Also, you see the name copular sentences, because you're coupling together, two words and saying this is equal to this, or this goes with this. And this would have a topic and a complement, or what we would call mubtada wa khabar in that case. And the verbal sentences have the quality in standard Arabic of basically having the agreement be only in terms of gender. So it doesn't matter if it's a plural or singular, it's always kataba or katabat, dhahaba or dhahabat when it's in that order. And of course, you could have the pronoun conjugated. So katabtu, katabna, katabu, etc. But those are basically not when you have an explicit subject, the explicit subject of saying يعني كتب الولد or كتبت البنت, you have an explicit subject there. In that case, only the gender. So you say كتبت البنات مش كتبنا البنات, and not كتبوا الأولاد. That happens, of course, in the dialects, but it's not in standard Arabic. I'm going to skip the passive just to keep things going. The verbal sentences, of course, as a result of this, because when we write, we're writing without diacritical marks. Many times there are actually things that could be ambiguous, right? So we don't necessarily know if I have a verb followed by a noun, like let's say the example of, ضرب الولد. I don't really know. Sorry to use examples of hitting and stuff, but if you say ضرب الولد, you don't know, is the boy who did the hitting, or is it the boy who was being hit in that case? Because it's ambiguous structurally. Without the case in standard Arabic, we wouldn't really know. And the same applies, of course, to the passive voice. When we don't specify the diacritics, we would have that ambiguity there. Copular sentences, of course, also the basic structure is to take a noun and an adjective, and typically the topic is definite. And this actually linguistically it's interesting because it's definite because it's kind of given. I'm telling you something I already know. You already know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about الولد, and I'm going to tell you some new information, and the new information is introduced without the definiteness. It's kind of like to kind of give you the information that you would add to the initial part. And these, of course, are used in common constructions that you're familiar with, like Kana and her sister, and Inna and her sisters, and so on. Now, so when we're trying to describe a syntax, we want to be able to relate all of these structures to each other in a meaningful way. So it's kind of something that we would keep in mind when we're designing these. Copular sentences also can have different kind of complements or أنواع خبر مختلفة. It could be a simple adjective, could be a prepositional phrase like the boy الولد في المكتبة, or another copular sentence like الولد كتابه كبير. And you can embed these further. You can say الولد كتابه لونه جميل, right? So like the boy, his book, the book's color is pretty, right? So Arabic allows you some degree of embedding there if you want. And of course, it can be a complete verbal sentence, and that's where we get the subject verb object order of الأولاد كتبوا الأشعار versus كتب الأولاد الأشعار, right? Okay, now in the noun phrases, the noun phrase structure, I had mentioned earlier when I was comparing to Chinese, we'd have the noun quite early on. Of course, you could have the demonstrative determiner like hada, etc., appear before it, but then everything basically follows. Agreement in Arabic um, is similar to agreement in many other languages that have this kind of rich morphology, where there's agreement in gender, number, and definiteness. But there's also some weird exceptional agreements with things that are like what's called غير العاقل. So I'm going to say a word on this because I think it's kind of interesting. And there's a paper and a resource that we worked on. So if you think of agreements as basically saying, these two words should have the same gender and number. So I say الطالبات الماهرات, right? I don't say الطالبات الماهرون. I don't say الطالبات الماهر. I don't say الطالبات الماهرة. Sounds weird to say. It's الطالبات الماهرات, right? But if you try to identify like what are the general rules in Arabic for doing this, you find some really cool weird things. Like for example, if it was عمال ماهرون, عمال in this case is plural, right? Masculine and plural, and mahirun is masculine and plural. Al-ab is plural, but it takes a singular adjective. So we say al-ab jadida, مش al-ab jadidat or al-ab jadidun, right? It's al-ab jadida. And the reason that is because the difference between al-ab and ummal is considered rational and al-ab is irrational. So aqil, غير aqil, right? Now add to this the issue, two more issues. One is when you have numbers like khams and khamsa. I don't know if you remember this from school, but you're supposed to say for عامل عمال, you should say khamsatu عمال. You should use the feminine form to go with the word عمال because عمال is masculine. It's like it's a reverse gender rule. Flip the gender of the singular form. And in the case of al'ab, it's khams because the singular is لعبة, it's feminine, so you have to use the masculine. This is one of the wildest rules, of flip the gender of the agreement between the number and the noun that follows it. Oddly enough, by the way, this is not unique to Arabic. Our sister language from the Semitic family, Hebrew, اللغة العبرية, actually in the classical form of it had the same thing. And in principle, in modern Hebrew, they should have the rule, but they break it all the time because it's a hard rule to remember and apply. So this is actually something we studied, and we use syntax to help us identify, basically, if I model simple, if you just ignore all of these tables, except maybe the first part here. If I model a simple rule in Arabic that basically says everything agrees simply. If it's masculine, it's masculine for the adjective. If it's plural, it's plural. And you do just that and forget about rationality, you're only correct 66% of the time. So in one third of the times, technically your system will say the sentence is wrong, which is obviously not correct, right? The moment we add information about rationality and about things like broken plurals and how to model them, the number goes into the mid 90s, and this is a kind of really cool result, basically of that could be used actually for checking if the quality of a syntactic tree is consistent and so on and so forth. So just wanted to kind of, sorry, it was a bit of a deeper dig here, but it felt appropriate. Okay. Uh, Continuing. My Another kind of construction in Arabic that we have that is important here is called the idafa construction. And in Arabic, this is when you put two nouns next to each other with the implied of relationship between them. So you could have really long chains like lon, muftah, bab, bayt, jiran, ibn, am, fulan, right? And you this is completely parsable in Arabic, and that's what would make what we'd call an idafa chain. Uh, uh, this depends on the definiteness to some degree, but the definite article also participates in many other ways in the structuring of sentences in Arabic. So if I take two words like katib and fannan, I can generate all four combinations that are all valid but different syntactic structures. So katib فنان, الكاتب الفنان, الكاتب فنان, and كاتب الفنان, all of them have different meanings, but they're all basically valid. Alif Lam is used all over the place in Arabic because it's actually incredibly important. Without it, a lot of glue and a lot of structure gets broken in Arabic. It's really an extremely important. It's beyond definiteness. So I mean, it participates in syntax. Now, I'll say a couple of words on dialects just because it's fun. Often, a lot of people approach dialects as with the sentences like there is no grammar in the dialects, there is no syntax in the dialect, which of course is completely nonsensical, right? Otherwise, if there's no syntax in a language, how could that language be acquired by anybody? And it cannot be that one day, Bab el Bayt means the door of the house, and the next time it's the house of the door or something else. It makes no sense. Obviously, there's syntax. What people are usually thinking of is that there is no official syntax that is prescriptive syntax from, مجمع اللغة العربية, the Arab Academy, telling us how to speak in the dialect. It's a blessing and a curse that مجامع اللغات العربية basically ignore the dialects and don't recognize them. They leave them kind of naturally growing and healthy on their own way. But it's a curse also because it means, people cannot actually have the same way of thinking of their dialect and their language that they would have that ability when they think of standard Arabic. You can do pretty much any syntactic analysis in any language. Now, the interesting thing also to remember is that the syntax of the standard doesn't necessarily apply to the dialect, right? And this is a mistake that people would say. You cannot say this in the dialect because in standard Arabic, in Fusha, we do that, but Fusha is another language, right? It doesn't work the same way. I'll give some examples here. So, for example, one is the tamarbuta. Right. So the tamarbuta, which is a really interesting phenomenon in Arabic because it's kind of a morphophonemic unit. It has a particular phonological value that has an a with a t sound. Now, in standard Arabic, it's always used except at the end of a sentence or the end of a phrase, what's called waqf. So you would say, جاءت الأميرة الجميلة, that's good. And جاءت الأميرة الجميلة, that's also good, right? So Jamila and Jamila in that case would be good. But if you do things like Amiratul Qasri, you have to say Amirat. Amiratul Qasri is unavoidable. Now, in the dialect, that is the case, that the T is only pronounced in the Idafa and nowhere else. So you cannot say, you have to say, Amirt al-Asr, مثلا, right? But you cannot say, El-Amirt or Emirat get, right? That doesn't make any sense, basically, in the Egyptian. Now, you can see the relationship between them, but it's often interesting that we kind of collapse these. And in the dialect, of course, we have another construction like this exponent that connects between the words that's equivalent of English of or French de. So مثل الملك تبع الأردن, الملك بتاع الأردن, بتاع الأردن, مال الأردن, ديال الأردن, right? And those are basically all serving the same kind of role. And interestingly, that structure does not exist in Fusha, right? There's nothing equivalent to it in Fusha. People sometimes do things like خاصة الباب خاصة البيت, but I find that to be very, what's the word? Aranji. I don't know if you've seen this term, Aranji, as it's Arabi Franji style. Like you're kind of forcing the translation from a foreign language into Arabic. You wouldn't say that. Um, Other things also that are kind of interesting, if you look at demonstrative particles. So, for instance, Standard Arabic gives you the ability to talk about proximal and distal. So you have هذا هذه for القريب and ذلك وتلك للبعيد. Egyptian does not make a distinction between قريب وبعيد. It's all دا دي دول. They don't make a distinction, right? So you'd have to say الحاجة دي هناك, this thing over there, but you cannot say there's nothing equivalent to tilka, over there. Levantine does that and does more. So we have هذا هذه هدول for للقريب, هداك هديك هدوك للبعيد. And then you also have a proclitic ha, yeah, as I saying شفت لك هالبيت, as like this house. And it's actually it's actually not in any specific location. It's like I'm bringing your attention to something to have in mind about the house in this example. And word order also varies to some degree. So you could have had a rajul, or in Egyptian, strictly you have to do a ragil da. Other dialects would do a mix between these. One last thing on these is the differences in how we do negation syntactically, right? And in Standard Arabic, there's only one path to do it, which is you have a prefix or a pre-word, like la, lam, len, and ma. لا يذهب, لم يذهب, لن يذهب, ما يذهب إلى آخره. And there's nothing else, right? But if you go to Egyptian, you will find things like and also believe this is in Moroccan, the negation of ma and sheen. You can take any verb in the language and just put it between ma and sheen, and you've negated it. So راح ما راح, شاف ما شافش, أكلها ما أكلهاش, سمعها سمعناهم, سمعناهم ما سمعناهمش, right? And it's a regular rule. It's not just kind of an odd naht that generates some weird word somewhere. It's actually a very generic standard rule that is used in the language. Levantine does the same, but also allows you to drop the ma. So you can say things like بديش أروح, as in ما بديش أروح, right? And of course, the sheen, it will be pointed out, is historically coming from shay. It's a form of like ما شفتش is like saying ما شفت شيئا, and I did not see a thing, actually, which we say in English too. I didn't see a thing, as in an exaggeration. And then but then you could say ما شفتش إشي or ما شفتش حاجة, right? So now the sheen does not really mean a thing anymore. It just is basically have grammaticalized, we would say, and became part of the morphology of the word, right? So to treat it correctly in a syntactic model, we have to be aware of its features separately from, when we're comparing to Standard Arabic. Oh, actually, one more thing about dialect, also, I forgot about the slide, is this question of, but is it that, for example, the verb subject and the subject verb are always, verb subject is only Fusha, subject verb is only dialect. So from work that was done with the team at the LDC almost 20 years ago, it's 2006 was the paper. We actually did an analysis to study this idea that verb subject versus subject verb would appear in disproportionately higher, in MSA versus the dialect. And an interesting thing, the initial result showed that that was not the case, and it was a bit surprising. The initial number, and this is not what you're seeing at the table, says that verb followed by a subject happens 70% of the time in the dialect, but only, 65% of the time in the Standard Arabic. And that seemed like a very odd thing, So we looked deeper. And it turned out that all of the cases where you have a pro-drop subject, this is what we would call in Arabic, when you do Arab and you say, ذهب إلى السوق, and you say ذهب فعل ماضي والفاعل ضمير مستتر تقديره هو, right? You say the subject is an elided pronoun referring to he. The syntactic trees we used by the LDC put the subject right after the verb in that case, but there's actually no word. There was not ذهب هو, it was just ذهب إلى السوق, right? And when you actually factor that analysis and you create this middle ground that says the subject is not explicit. like يعني الفاعل غير مسمى. You did not say the subject explicitly. The numbers actually shift, and now it is the subject verb is 35 in MSA versus 30 in the dialect, but the verb subject is a lot more in MSA than in the dialect. يعني 3 مرات, 35% versus 10%. And then, of course, in the dialect, there was a lot more of the pro drop. Now, why is that? Because the data set that we use, and this is again, if you're working with data, you have to know where the data come from. What does the data tell me? The data we were comparing, because we're comparing standard and dialect, is not parallel, right? So the MSA was news articles, and then the Levantine data in this case was telephone conversations in Jordanian Arabic. And a lot of the speakers were saying, أنا رحت, شفت, سمعت, قلت, قلتي, رحتي, right? So they're not saying انتي رحتي, انت رحت, etc. They're just using the word conjugated. So just important, when you're looking at data to kind of pay attention. All right. I'm worried about the time. I still have 15 minutes, Violetta, correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
actually
great.
20.
20, fantastic. So, so now that I've given you a sense of the problems or the phenomena that we need to be thinking about, let's talk about tree banks. So tree banks are simply, are corpora or databases, sets that basically represent sentences, ideally should be real world sentences that have been analyzed and validated into the analysis according to a particular framework and representation, a syntactic representation. Right. And often the way we create tree banks today is that we parse them automatically with a parser. Even a bad parser is better than a no parser. Like for example, I would today, if I'm working with some new dialect and I don't have data for, I would start with an Egyptian parser or a standard Arabic parser that I have, right? And then generate something and then have the human annotators check and correct these sentences. Now, importantly, of course, here is that we need to confirm the quality, of the annotation, and that's often done through what's called inter-annotator agreement. And this concept of IAA or inter-annotator agreement, you should see probably in other contexts too. It applies to anything to do with annotation. You basically want to prove to yourself first and to the world that the guidelines that you created are precise enough and helpful enough that two human beings who've just studied those guidelines can actually reach the same conclusion. Does that actually happen in reality? Not really. We could never get 100% agreement, partly because there is always a little bit of error, a little bit of different perspectives, a bit of different understanding. And also, as we're training people to do this task, they're basically, learning how to do it, right? So they would make mistakes along the way. And then we typically do rounds. I mean, recently I was working on a project, and after doing annotation for like, I don't know, like maybe 10,000 sentences, we had to throw them out and start redo them again from scratch because we were so unhappy with that the early stuff was much lower agreement than the later stuff, right? And we figured, okay, that's all training. So these resources cost a lot of money as a result, and a lot of time from people when they work on them. Now, for Arabic, there is lots of tree banks. So if this is something that you're interested in and syntax, I can put this as, some of the, I would say, the important resources. And their the big original one is the Pan Arabic Tree Bank from the LDC. To date is the largest. It's about 1 million words. And it has that just with part one, two, and three. And there's an additional like 10 or 11 parts that have been created, which are smaller in size though. There was a Levantine tree bank, the one I mentioned a bit earlier. The Prague dependency tree bank was a dependency representation, the first one. This was done in Czech Republic for Arabic. And then there was the Katib tree bank or the Columbia Arabic tree bank. And that's the one that I created when I was at Columbia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it more. And then also the Quran tree bank, which I'll show you some examples, is the most beautiful visually tree banks of all the tree banks that have been created. Now, up to that point of 2011, and even 2014, I would say, and more, all of these tree banks were created in the West. There were no Arabic tree banks created in the Arab world. It's Pennsylvania, Czech Republic, University of Leeds, Columbia University in New York City. And only when we got closer to like 2022, those were the early tree banks that I would say were created in the Arab world. And I think the Halabi one was created in Syria. It has a very different representation, and I have not seen much work done on their front. And then I created the Camel Tree Bank in the Camel Lab. Now, most of the tree banks are on news instead of Arabic. The dialectal one obviously have a bit more dialect. When we did the Camel Tree Bank, we intentionally wanted to mix things up and add more details. So I will say a few words about that in a couple of slides. Oh, and then all of these here are using the same representation, whereas in fact all the others are using slightly different representations. Maybe I shouldn't say that. The ARZB, the Egyptian, and the Pan-Arabic Tree Bank, they're all also the same representation. Okay, we've seen examples of the Pan-Arabic Tree Bank. This is the one with the 50,000 سائح from before, so I'm going to skip this. This is the Quranic one in corpus.quran.com. Again, I think anybody studying the Quran and is interested in syntax should check this out. Qais Dukes was a fantastic guy. Sadly, he passed away in his mid 30s, very young. And but he left us this wonderful resource, basically, that was created as part of his dissertation. And a lot of the data, I had the pleasure of working with this young man on his morphology work for the Quran, and that data is publicly available for people interested in it. So just wanted to point it out. Interestingly, by the way, he did not go with dependency of constituency. He did a hybrid representation, his own version, and he argued that that actually is more consistent with how Arab actually talks about Arabic. That's another whole long conversation, but I believe he also developed a parser as part of his dissertation, parsing, to my knowledge, the only hybrid dependency constituency representation. It was kind of cool work. I mentioned UD earlier. My team at NYU Abu Dhabi is the Arabic representative on UD, so we actually created the UD version, converted from the Pan-Arabic Tree Bank for them. So that was work that is also available. And then, of course, I'll say now a bit more about Katib. So Katib, or the Columbia Arabic Tree Bank, kind of faced a challenge, which was we were basically told syntax is important. These are the days, mind you, in 2009, and so we're still doing statistical machine translation. Nothing neural yet was making what it's making now, right? Okay. So people were worried in Arabic at the problem of when I'm doing statistical translation, statistical machine translation, and I do word alignment, I need to basically know where to move the verb to in the English side. Because remember, the verb appears at the beginning. So you'd have something like أعلن, declared. المتحدث الرسمي باسم الحكومة الروسية اليوم الخميس عن غضبه, right? So the declared the official speaker of the Russian government today, whatever, Thursday, and then what he said, عن غضبه, right? So when you translate to English, you're not going to keep declare at the beginning. You have to say, the official speaker of the Russian government, and then you put said, on Monday, blah, blah, blah. So you have to know where to move that verb exactly. And how did they do that? Actually, machine translation those days was failing miserably. The verb would disappear, gets moved in the middle somewhere. So it would look like, the official speaker declared the Russian government, right? I mean, it was creating weird things. So syntax was thought of as a solution. The Pan-Arabic Tree Bank existed, of course. People were using it, but they thought we needed more data. But the problem is the process is very slow. It took 6 months to train people to train in the LDC. 6 months to train before they're allowed to start adding. And then the process was quite slow after that too. So I got the challenge basically from the funders at the time of basically saying, can you create 200,000 words in 6 months, including training people who've never seen your representation and building a parser? Okay. So, like an idiot I decided to do that. And I thought, I mean, at the time I had lots of other projects, but I have to tell you, it took over my life basically for the 6 months because it became a source of stress. But I'm very glad at the end that I did not get scared from it. And it kind of gave birth to this idea. So what we ended up doing is basically doubling the speed. We could do up to 700 words per hour. and train people in less than 2 months, basically, and have them do the 200,000 words by the deadline. In fact, we went over. We did 240,000 by the time we were done. And how did we do that? We did that by doing a couple of things, which I will say next. We followed standard tokenizations that already had existing tools for them. So we did not complicate matters. We went with the standard tokenization, which separated all of the clitics, and we simplified the dependency completely. So there's only 6 tags and 8 dependencies, right? And it was kind of shockingly low number. Of course, don't forget, in standard Arabic, in Fusha, you say أقسام الكلام ثلاثة فعل واسم وحرف. So at least this is double, right? But it's very small compared to the 40 something that was used at the LDC, and definitely the number of dependencies was also smaller compared to other models. And this is the list. I'm going to actually jump in directly into examples because we can spend a lot of time talking about these. And okay, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the paper has, I think, maybe like 50 or so trees, that show the power of the representation. I'm just going to take this one example here, which is the one that we've talked about before. This is in cat representation. I mean, you've seen this example already. So the part of speech is just simply verb, nom, PRT, and prop. Prop is a proper noun. We avoided, by coming up with nom or nominal, avoided having to worry about is it an adjective or a noun, right? Because that's actually a hard problem in Arabic, defining, if it's an adjective or a noun. There's a lot more work that's have been happening since then. We also relied on people knowing concepts like tamyiz and idafa from Arab, and we just introduced them. So we made this representation almost like the quickest, fastest way you can go to syntactic representation if you know Arab, right? Just a few things had to be adjusted in your thinking, and the rest was much easier. It's actually simpler than Arab because, for example, a lot of things like الحال, المفعول المطلق, المفعول فيه, أنواع كثير من المفاعيل, we basically elided them. We just said, it's either an object or a modifier, and we defined what that is, and that was the end of that, right? So it simplified the structure a lot. If you're really interested in this, I would recommend the paper on it that has like all of these details, and the guidelines are all publicly available also. All right. One last word here is on the camel tree bank. And as I said, up to about the year 2020 something, most of the tree banks were done in the West, and I wanted to basically do something that is a bit different, and wanted to address some of the problems we had. Another thing that you have to be aware of if you work with data, which is basically availability of the data, right? So the LDC MSA news data. While the LDC owns the rights to the representation of the dependencies, they don't own the right to the original sentences, right? These came from newspapers, right? They had contracts with them. So one of the things I wanted to do is to avoid this issue, and that's why I went with having a range of data sets, text. So it was basically free of copyright. Um, if you look at the 13 subcorpora, they included things like المعلقات, صور من القرآن, الحديث, ليالي من ألف ليلة وليلة, حي بن يقظان, ترجمة التوراة والإنجيل بدايتهم. We only picked a small amount, so about 9,000 words, 10,000 words from here and there. And why did we pick those numbers? Because there's not enough money. I mean, this cost a lot of getting this project done was close to about $40,000 was the budget that had to go, and that's the lower estimate because there was additional funds that you had to add to it too. Paying people to do this work takes time to do, and it's a very intense kind of work, as you can imagine. But also the newer stuff we picked all to be out of copyright or basically data sets that have been publicly available, like the Qalb corpus, which was used for error, grammatical error correction, or Wikinews, which is public, news from the Wikimedia Foundation, and so on. So we basically this allowed us, of course, to do interesting things like basically compare complexity of analysis across this wide range. which, up to that point has not happened. I'm going to skip through these extensions here. Wanted to quickly show you this tool actually. So we have a tool called Palmera. Let's see if I can, yeah. This is actual tool. If you go to Palmera, you can upload a file. I just uploaded ahead of time the sentences, a sentence from Alf Layla wa Layla, and you can basically, scroll through it. And then when the annotators would get this tree, so let's say they say, oh no, this doesn't belong here. I'm gonna move it up to here, right? Or oh no no no, this here goes to here. Let's say, right? And that's what they're doing. And then they would select, and then they would modify the relationships in this. And then it allows you to like, cluster the constituents together. So this is here, everything is under this has been basically dropped together. So if you're interested in syntax and things like this, please check out this tool. It uses the standard Connell representation for syntax. So you will not be doing something kind of unique and off, but it's part of what people are doing in Arabic and other languages. Let's see, just worried about the time. In terms of the evaluation, I'm going to mention a couple of things here. These are the only ones you need to know. I mean, labeled attachment and unlabeled attachment and label score. Because this is basically a tree representation, you're basically comparing, how often do I get the parent correctly? How often do I get the relation correctly? And how get both, let's say, right? So in this particular example, all the slides, by the way, will be shared with Professor Violetta, so you will have access to it and you can play with it further if you want. You can calculate numbers like, 40% labeled, 80% unlabeled, and 60 for label in this very simple example. So this is just to give you a sense of what these numbers mean when we present them. So when we talk about annotation agreement and the degree of validation between the annotators, the numbers were quite high, and that's good. You want numbers in the 99 point something range. But in fact, if you look at some data sets like Zaybak, for example, was in the 98% range. However, the New Testament was in the 90 range. So there was a lot of disagreements. When we look at them, most of the disagreement seems to be coming from punctuation and attachment of prepositions, which you probably have encountered the PP attachment problem before. The numbers as far as the parsers that we used also have a wide range of performance, that also varied basically in terms of the quality from across the different data set. It was generally quite hard to parse this data because it is actually not anything like any of the training that we have. So all of the training here was done on news, and then the evaluation was done on these data sets. So it would make sense that you would get 56% accuracy. Horrible number, right? But if you are parsing mu'allaqat using only modern news, right? So, but again, the purpose here was to create the data so that we can develop tools that can improve on it, right? That's the whole purpose of this. I'll skip this one, and I'm just going to go to a couple of kind of cool observations that we discovered, and this is in the paper of the Camel Tree Bank. So one is what we call the tokenization ratio issue. So as you know, Arabic, if you have a word like, وَسَيَكْتُبُونَها is one word, but it's actually multiple tokens. It's wa and sa and yaktubun and ha. And here we would say it's 4/1 is basically the ratio of token to word is 4. Now, in Arabic, in the Arabian Nights, that ratio was about 1.45. In modern news, it's about 1.2, I believe, or something like this. But we were curious, like, is it that words used to be bigger or smaller? And what we found, if you compare to the text century, from a simple set of data points here, that the older the text, the higher the token words. It seems like older texts like the Quran and even Alf Layla Layla wal Mu'allaqat had bigger words than what we have in modern standard Arabic. So we've gone to simplify words. Now, in the standard language, in the dialects, there's other weirdnesses that happen. But also, in contrast, one other observation was if you look at the Idafa chain, remember the Rais Majlis Idarat Shirkit Microsoft as an Idafa chain, we noticed that in fact, Oddly, the Quran has almost the maximum idafa chain is two. There's really very limited idafa constructions, whereas in the news you can get to five. And in fact, in PATB, we've seen even six or seven, if I remember correctly, like Rais Majlis Idara Shirkat Microsoft, right? So that's kind of interesting that Arabic language over a period of 1,400 years, in what it considers normal text or special text, right, went from, having bigger words, smaller chains, to being smaller words, bigger chains, right? Seems like interesting, but again, something that perhaps people interested in data science analysis of historical linguistics could look into. And of course, if we do just lexical similarity, we see a lot of interesting things. So, like the Old and New Testaments were similar. The Penn Tree Bank and the Wiki News are very similar because they're both news. And then lots of things like Hadith, oddly, was closer to the Alf Layla Layla and the New Testament and Old Testament, lexically at least. But then we find the Quran stands separate, and the odes or the mu'allaqat stood the most different from everybody else. Intuitively, that seems to all make sense, basically, from this. All right. I will stop, but just want to point out a couple of things quickly. We have a paper that was just published recently on a new parser. So this is from a couple of years ago now. And this is the Camel Parser 2.0. This is all publicly available. If you're interested in parsing and playing with parsing, I would recommend it. In fact, I should say, where did this go? Yeah, in fact, in Palmera, if you go to that tool, to the front page of it, and use online, you can actually put in a sentence here and select the parser, and it will parse for you. So if you're curious, like within 5 minutes, you can create your own parse tree. Put a sentence and then run it, and then you will get the parse automatically done for you. So that's kind of cool. And then the last thing I will say is we just got a paper accepted that will be published in LREC, which will be in May this year. And it's actually parsing Arabic dialects. And here we actually show results on Egyptian and Gulf Arabic, where the Camel Parser 2.0, the one that I was just saying good things about, does badly on Egyptian and Gulf, but then we've managed to improve by about 10 to 8 percent point absolute. So if you're interested in parsing dialects, interested in parsing standard Arabic, please consider using these tools. And I will stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.